Across the country, we're seeing so many competitive real estate markets right now where there's a shortage of homes compared to the number of buyers who are out there, especially the good homes, and so much competition, multiple offers, things selling right away, a lot of frustration, people having trouble getting homes, just writing offers and getting beat out over and over. People, defiant about the market, just like not getting into it because they're like, it's too hard. I can't even go look at one. It sells before I get into it, So a lot of that going on out there, but there are also buyers right now who are super successful in these markets. They're thriving. They're getting the homes they want. They're getting good prices. They're beating out the competition. And so we're going to be talking about some of the strategies and tactics that the successful buyers are using to win. And that's really what it takes right now. Is it takes adopting new mindsets. It takes having tactics in place before getting into the market. Literally focus on what it's going to take to win in a competitive situation, and to do that intelligently. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And in the tidbit today, we're actually talking about a huge area for strategy, which is around emotion. And emotion plays a huge factor in someone's success in this kind of market. And one of the things that I really like to point out, it's super important, is to know this, is that as beings, as human beings, our behavior is driven by emotion. If you really think about that and go deep with it, the reason that we choose to do things, any choice we make at its base, at the core, is driven by emotion. It's an emotional drive that makes us want things. That's what marketers and advertisers play on in all the stuff they do. It's always emotion. They stir that up, and before long we're buying things. But it's true about all kinds of behavior. And the key to thriving in a competitive market is to understand the emotion that's driving your decision making, like to know what it is. What's the emotional reason I'm moving? What's the emotional reason I'm going for a home on this side of town, a home with an extra room, a home this much closer to work? Those are all sort of logical things, but underneath it, at the core, the drive, the thing that makes us want it, is emotion. So it's really important to be clear on what the emotion is, like to know, to look at it. And then, knowing what the emotion is, the next step is to be very certain that logic is what's actually guiding your decisions. Now, all of this sounds simple. We teach classes for real estate investors where we delve into this a lot because great real estate investors have to be brilliant at logical decisions, but even those guys are driven by emotion underneath. And some of the worst investing decisions I've ever seen made were done when somebody didn't understand the emotion underneath and then applied logic. So step one is get super clear on the emotional reason for what you're doing. What is the emotional drive? Put it that way. But then step two is make sure that it's logic that's guiding decisions when you get into the process. Now that sounds pretty easy maybe in a sentence, but it's more tricky in practice, and in fact can be something that one works on a little bit to get good at it. I'm going to tell you a super quick story that illustrates the point. When I was a young realtor, one of my first clients was somebody who had very specific needs in the home. They had special needs. It was a hard kind of property to find. And it took us the better part of 6 months to even find a property that met their needs. And this wasn't a tight market. There was plenty of inventory, but they just had very specific needs. And when we found the home, it was priced for more than they wanted to spend, but they really needed it and wanted it, and so they went after it. And we negotiated with the seller. It was not an easy negotiation. We ended up, still apart, but the buyer sort of begrudgingly went to what the seller was their bottom line because this was a perfect home. And then we got to the inspections. And in the home inspection, some repairs turned up, and the seller didn't want to do them because the seller was already at their rock bottom price. And the buyer didn't want to pay for them because the buyer already felt like they were paying more than they should. And the buyer got defiant and basically at the end walked away from that home over $500. So $500 issue on the inspections, and it was the voice of defiance for them. They were like, well, it's the principal. The seller should fix that, and I've had enough, and forget it. The deal's off, over $500 for a home that took 6 months to find. And in the end, we found another one 4 months later that wasn't nearly as good as this one. It was okay for what they needed, but not great. And that's what happened. And that was an example of letting emotion get in the way of logic. What are some places where emotion often gets in the way in a transaction? And the two most painful places for people in most real estate transactions are around the price of the home and the rate on the loan. Okay? Like those two things are the place where people often have emotion rise up and overtake logic, and often where they make some mistakes. So one thing I want to show you for a few minutes is some perspective on these two things. And it's really important to have this logically when going into a competitive market. So one key thing is that it's really important to know that with price, if you have a $5,000 difference at 5.5%, which is definitely a rate that's high compared to the market at the time we're filming this, but 5.5% and 5K, you've got a difference of about 28 bucks a month. Now, the buyer I was telling you about a few moments ago walked away over 500 bucks, right? But $5 grand, 28 bucks a month. 28 bucks a month in the scheme of an appreciating market, okay, is nothing, really. In the scheme of a large investment, it's not that much, 5 grand. Many of the markets right now, if you had to pay 5 grand more to beat out 2 or 3 or 10 or 20 other people, you're likely to make that back quickly because of appreciation, And again, your realtor in the market where you are is going to advise what's smart. We're presenting this as a concept for perspective. You rely on your realtor in the local market for what's smart to pay for a home. But the point is to watch very closely. If you see emotion coming up for you around price and resistance around things like it's another 5 grand to win, how much is $1,000? Which I've seen people, win because they put an escalation clause in and they beat somebody out by $1 grand. So that's 8 bucks a month, right? Or I take that back, $565 a month. Keep it straight, right? $565 a month. So perspective around this is super important before you get into the heat of a negotiation or a competitive situation. Okay. Same thing with rate. Most lenders, if you're getting a national market loan, are going to be very similar to each other in rate. There are differences, but generally speaking, they'll be within 1/8% of each other. And so a lot of people go look for the lender who has the lowest rate. They get emotional about that and don't have the logical perspective to understand that there's a lot more to a lender than rate. The structure of a loan, the fees that are charged, has a lot to do with what cost is over time. But also there's the question of, does the lender get it done? Do they have a pre-approval letter that helps you win against competition? Do they guarantee what they're doing? How quickly can they give a commitment? That's a way that a lot of people win. Like there's a lot of features to a lender that are not rate. And many people who get emotional focus on rate and miss out on the stuff that actually will help them win. And it's interesting because, if lenders are generally within 1/8% of each other, on a 100K loan, it's 8 bucks a month, and 0.5% is 32 bucks a month. So, lenders are generally much closer to each other than, a half, and it's usually within 1/8. So a big place for logic is to, of course, look at the cost of the loan, but really focus on what is the structure, how much strategy is that lender employing, are they listening to you, is there a holistic strategy in place, what are they going to do to help you win, how is their pre-approval better than the 10 people you're competing against, their lenders, for the same home. Those are logical, important questions in a market that's competitive if you want to win. So perspectives, very important.